The breath of the earth was cold against my skin, a constant, subterranean whisper that wrapped around the concrete walls of my sanctuary. I had carved this life for myself deep within the abandoned mine, a place where the clamor of the surface world faded to an irrelevant hum. Here, miles beneath the sun-drenched forests, my world was a precise ballet of silent machines and luminous data. My instruments, a meticulously assembled network of sensors and receivers, reached beyond the crust, beyond the atmosphere, to listen to the oldest stories told by light. For years, this routine had been my anchor, the deep quiet, the rhythmic pulse of my server racks, the celestial tapestry unfurling across my primary display. I was Cole Chen, and the universe, in its quiet, indifferent majesty, was my only confidant. I sought not answers, but patterns, not meaning, but the elegant, predictable dance of gravity and light. My dedication was absolute, my reclusiveness a necessary sacrifice for the purity of observation. Tonight, the target was IC 1101, a supergiant elliptical galaxy, its distant sprawl a familiar friend on my screens. The data streamed in, a torrent of spectral lines and photometric readings, each pixel a testament to billions of years of cosmic evolution. I charted its expansion, its subtle gravitational influences on its neighbors, lost in the quiet thrill of knowing. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and dust, felt alive with purpose. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch of the console, moved with an almost unconscious grace, adjusting parameters, refining filters. Then, a flicker. It was almost imperceptible at first, a ghost in the noise, a single anomalous spike in a frequency band that should have been utterly barren. My gaze sharpened, pulling me from the hypnotic flow of IC 1101. I isolated the anomaly, routing it through a secondary array, my brow furrowing. The source coordinates resolved, slowly, agonizingly, pointing not to a star, not to a galaxy, not even to a nebula. They pointed to the void. The vast, lightless chasm between galaxies, the cosmic lacuna where matter was sparse beyond comprehension, where the fabric of reality stretched thin and empty. My mind, a fortress of established physics, balked. This was an error. A calibration flaw. A stray particle, perhaps, or a glitch in the aged wiring that snaked through the mind's excavated tunnels. I ran diagnostics, a battery of tests designed to expose any weakness in my system. The hum of the machinery remained steady, the indicators glowed green. No errors. I recalibrated the primary receiver, then the secondary. My curiosity, a coiled spring within me, began to unwind. This wasn't merely an anomaly, it was an impossibility. I shifted my focus entirely, redirecting the full power of my arrays towards the empty coordinates. The signal resolved with greater clarity, a thin, wavering line against the black. Its waveform was unlike anything I had ever encountered, no known stellar signature, no pulsar's rhythmic thrum, no echo of a distant supernova. It was too structured, too clean. This was not the random static of the universe. This held purpose. It possessed an unsettling, deliberate pattern that defied the very laws of entropy I had dedicated my life to observing. My fingers hesitated above the console, a sudden reluctance seizing me. What if this was not a discovery, but an intrusion? I pushed the thought away, a scientist's resolve hardening my jaw. Fear was a luxury I could not afford when faced with the unknown. I initiated a deep scan, instructing the system to analyze every measurable parameter of the signal, to dissect its impossible structure down to its barest components. The processing lights on my console flickered like distant stars, reflecting in the faint sheen of sweat on my forehead. Hours bled into each other. The air in the abandoned mine grew heavier, charged with unspoken possibility. I didn't move, didn't eat, didn't even blink away the dryness in my eyes. My gaze was fixed on the screen, on the evolving data visualizations. The signal wasn't random, it possessed a complex periodicity, a nested sequence that hinted at layers of information. It was like finding a perfect, crystalline snowflake in the vacuum of space, a structure that demanded an architect. The initial scientific thrill began to curdle, replaced by a growing unease. Intentional. The universe had always been a grand, impersonal clockwork, beautiful in its indifference, but this? This felt like a direct address. This anomaly wasn't just a deviation, it was a rupture. It suggested a hidden layer to reality, a profound secret kept by the vast emptiness between the stars. And I, in my solitary quest for knowledge, had just stumbled upon its threshold. My fingers, stiff from hours hunched over the console, hovered above the illuminated keys. The anomaly, a jagged scar across the otherwise placid data stream, still pulsed on my primary display. It was a phantom limb of information, something my instruments had registered but my mind refused to accept. A void, an absolute absence of matter or energy, should offer nothing but silence. Yet, my deep space array had sung a different, impossible tune. I ran the preliminary scans again, a ritualistic act of defiance against the impossible. Each line of code, each diagnostic sweep, was designed to find fault, a miscalibration, a stray cosmic ray, an error in the system's logic. The glowing green text scrolled relentlessly, confirming every parameter, every sensor reading. The array was pristine, its optical mirrors perfectly aligned, its cryocoolers humming at optimal efficiency. The data, raw and uncorrupted, remained stubbornly consistent. The signal, if it could even be called that, was not an error. It was real. A knot tightened in my gut. What I was observing defied every principle of astrophysics I had spent a lifetime mastering. Energy from nothing. Structure from absence. It was a blasphemy against the very vacuum of space. I scrubbed the data for stellar flares, for gravitational lensing events, for any known astrophysical phenomenon that could mimic such an output. Nothing. Days bled into a singular, unbroken vigil. The stale air of the abandoned mine grew heavy with the scent of ozone and my own mounting exhaustion. My meals became an afterthought, a mechanical necessity. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every flicker of the display, every subtle shift in the spectral analysis, pulled me deeper into the anomaly's impossible gravity. I began to perceive a faint, underlying rhythm within the chaotic bursts of energy. It wasn't random noise, it was patterned. I isolated the most prominent frequency bands, filtering out the cosmic background radiation, stripping away the expected stellar echoes. What remained was a residual murmur, a statistical impossibility that refused to dissipate. I magnified the waveform, stretching the temporal scale until the individual pulses, previously a blur, began to resolve into distinct shapes. There, embedded within the seemingly random fluctuations, was a repeating sequence. Not a simple sine wave, but a complex, almost fractal arrangement of peaks and troughs, repeating with an unnerving precision. My breath hitched. My heart, a drum against my ribs, quickened its tempo. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a ghost in the machine, but it was there. It wasn't a natural occurrence. This was too ordered, too intricate, to be an accident of physics. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a message. Or, more terrifyingly, a signature. Something deliberate was happening in that impossible emptiness between galaxies. I felt a magnetic pull, an irresistible urge to unravel this cosmic riddle. The faint, repeating pattern on my screen became a siren song, promising forbidden knowledge. My eyes, raw and gritty, tracked the oscillating waveforms. The anomaly, a jagged scar across the cosmic silence, pulsed with an alien rhythm. I had logged 72 continuous hours, fueled by stale coffee and an obsession that gnawed at the edges of my perception. It was during one of these endless stretches, as I meticulously cross-referenced spectral data, that the first subtle fracture appeared. I blinked, rubbed my temples, and dismissed it as a trick of tired eyes, a phantom born of the stark contrast between screen light and the cavernous gloom. But the phantom lingered, weaving itself into the fabric of my awareness. The hum of the cooling fans, usually a steady drone, seemed to waver, its pitch subtly shifting, then resolving itself back to normal. My fingers, poised over the keyboard, sometimes felt alien, disconnected, as if guided by an invisible current. I attributed it all to the relentless pressure, the sheer cognitive load of deciphering something that fundamentally defied explanation. My mind, I reasoned, was a complex machine pushed to its limits, prone to misfires and erroneous readings. It was a comforting, human explanation for an increasingly inhuman phenomenon. Then came the scent. It wasn't the familiar smell of damp rock or warm electronics. This was new, sharp, and invasive. I sniffed the air, turning my head, seeking a source in the quiet machinery, the sealed environment of my observation chamber. There was none. The air filtration system hummed its steady song. Yet the aroma persisted, a phantom scent clinging to the back of my throat, making my stomach clench with an inexplicable unease. Sleep offered no respite. I would drift into a state of semi-consciousness, not truly sleeping, but lost in a vision of impossible geometries. Vast, indifferent structures, not built of matter but of pure, crushing scale, would unfurl before me. I heard no sounds, yet a deep resonance vibrated through my very bones, a soundless scream that promised ultimate dissolution. One cycle, I found myself staring at a data stream, the numbers blurring, then reforming into patterns that seemed to shift and writhe. My breath plumed before me. I checked the environmental controls, they registered a stable temperature. The monitors, however, flickered, not with a technical glitch, but with a subtle, internal tremor, as if the very light they emitted was distressed. My fatigue, my stress, my isolation, they were all real, but they were not the cause. This was not merely my mind breaking down under strain. This was something else. The anomaly was not just a signal I observed, it was a presence. It was reaching. They were deliberate, tailored invasions. A horrifying, undeniable truth solidified in my mind. The signal was not merely transmitting information, it was attempting to interact. It was exploring, probing, and the abandoned mind, my sanctuary, my refuge, was no longer merely a place of observation. It had become a point of contact, a conduit. And I, Cole, the solitary observer, was the focus of its indifferent, ancient gaze. Here, miles beneath the sun, the impossible signal had found me, and now, it demanded validation. My initial determination, a fierce, protective instinct for scientific truth, still burned, but a new, colder ember of dread flickered within it. I turned to the primary console. It screens a constellation of data streams. To prove its reality, I needed external corroboration. My own instruments, painstakingly calibrated, were beyond reproach, yet the scientific method demanded more than my solitary conviction. My first attempt was to cross-reference with the global network of astronomical observatories. I navigated through secure channels, accessing vast public archives, searching for any recorded anomaly in that precise celestial coordinate. I wasn't looking for the exact signal, that would be too much to hope for, but for any unusual energy signature, any unexplained variance in the background radiation that might hint at its presence. Hours bled into one another, the glow of the monitors painting my face in shifting hues of green and blue. Nothing. Not merely an absence of my signal, but a startling, almost aggressive blankness where there should have been the usual cosmic static. Regions of space I knew to be teeming with faint, distant emissions were rendered utterly sterile in the public logs. My own data, vibrant and alive, stood in stark contrast to this barren digital landscape. A tremor of unease snaked through me. This wasn't just a lack of corroboration, it was an active denial, a silent, cosmic refusal. My own recorded observations, when uploaded to a cross-referencing algorithm, simply vanished, overwritten by generic background noise, as if my system had hallucinated the entire event. I tried again, isolating the specific data packets, only for them to corrupt upon upload, dissolving into meaningless strings of characters. This was not a system error. This felt. My hands hovered over the controls, hesitant. The signal, unwavering on my personal screen, seemed to pulse with a knowing rhythm, a silent, mocking testament to its own elusive nature. My next step, reluctantly taken, was to reach out. There was only one colleague I trusted enough, or perhaps, distrusted least, with such a delicate, potentially career-ending revelation. A former peer, known for his acerbic wit and unshakable skepticism, the theoretician worked at a remote research facility on the surface. I composed a careful message, stripping my findings of any unsettling implications, presenting only the raw, perplexing data points of an unexplained EM anomaly detected by my deep space array. I framed it as a technical puzzle, an instrument calibration issue I couldn't quite resolve alone, hoping his rigorous mind might offer a mundane explanation. This looks like standard background noise, perhaps an atmospheric distortion if your array isn't properly shielded. Or, dare I say, a phantom. You've been down there too long. Come up for air. The universe has no secrets it doesn't eventually yield to proper observation, not to solitary obsession. The word stung, not just for their dismissal, but for the subtle jab at my chosen isolation. He hadn't even engaged with the specifics of the data, merely waved it away with a dismissive hand. A phantom. Was I truly so lost in my subterranean world that I was inventing signals, conjuring cosmic phantoms from the static? I stared at my primary monitor. The impossible signal continued its silent dance, vibrant and undeniable. It wasn't background noise. It wasn't atmospheric distortion. My array was shielded against every conceivable interference. Yet, beneath the doubt, a stubborn, terrifying certainty gnawed, this thing was real. And it was actively resisting being seen, being understood, by anyone but me. A new, subtle hum vibrated through the mind's concrete walls, a faint, almost imperceptible resonance that had not been there before. It was not the usual groan of settling rock or the distant thrum of the ventilation system. This was different, a low, resonant frequency that seemed to emanate from the very air around me, an echo of the signal itself, now permeating the physical space. My skin prickled. The screens on my console, usually stable, flickered with an almost imperceptible ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen current. The universe, I realized with a growing horror, was not simply withholding its secrets. It was actively guarding them, and I, Cole Chen, had somehow stumbled upon a lock it did not wish to be picked. I was alone, truly alone, with a truth no one else could, or would, see. And the weight of that solitary perception was beginning to crush me. The phantom, a whisper from the void, clung to me like the damp, cold air of the abandoned mine. His words, a chilling echo, sought to unmoor me, to set me adrift in the very doubt he'd cast. But the signal, a discordant hymn only I could hear, resonated deeper than any human voice. It pulled me further into the labyrinthine darkness, past skeletal timbers and rusted tracks, a determination cold and sharp as the subterranean wind my only companion. I would not be swayed. Not when the impossible hummed so close, so insistent. Days bled into a singular, perpetual twilight. The flickering lantern, a defiant star against the mind's ancient gloom, became my sun, my moon. I lost track of its refills, of the meals I'd forgotten to eat. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant, decaying wood, grew heavier, each breath a struggle against an invisible weight. The mine itself seemed to breathe around me, its vast arteries shifting, groaning. Passages I swore I'd explored now twisted into unfamiliar configurations, walls undulating with a phantom current, their rough-hewn surfaces blurring into impossible geometries. Was it the light, failing, or my own eyes, betraying me? I hunched over the crude table I'd fashioned from salvaged planks, my instruments arrayed like a desperate altar. The screens, once crisp with data, now shimmered at the edges, the numbers dancing. My fingers, stained with dust and grime, traced the signal's spectral lines. It was a language, I knew it, a pattern woven from the very fabric of non-existence. But the patterns began to bleed into my vision even when I looked away. Sleep offered no refuge. The waking world dissolved into a sequence of vivid nightmares. I found myself talking, at first to the signal, then to the empty air, articulating theories, questioning the very walls. Are you listening? I demand, my voice raw and hoarse, the echo swallowing the words whole. Was this what I had become? A madman chasing ghosts in the belly of the earth? Yet, through the haze of disorientation, through the terrifying unraveling of my mind, the signal's patterns sharpened with an unnerving clarity. It wasn't just static, not random noise. It was a deliberate, complex arrangement of frequencies and amplitudes, shifting with a terrifying, alien precision. I saw the repeating sequences, the nested symmetries, the impossible echoes of itself within itself. It was a fractal of thought, a cosmic calculus utterly beyond human comprehension, yet somehow, my fractured mind began to grasp its terrible elegance. Then, a flicker, a revelation that pierced through the temporal fog and spatial distortions like a shard of black ice. I had been mapping the signal's phase shifts, its subtle undulations across the electromagnetic spectrum, trying to find a consistent anchor. And there it was, not a flaw, but a deliberate, almost imperious signature embedded within the very noise. These weren't gaps in transmission, they were punctuation. A sequence of prime numbers, a mathematical sequence that had no place in random cosmic phenomena, a signature of profound, terrifying intent. This wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a message. A deliberate, infinitely patient utterance from something that observed, that calculated, that communicated. Not a distress call, not a natural phenomenon, but a carefully constructed, mathematical declaration. And the horror of it was not in the message itself, which remained indecipherable beyond its prime number signature. My mind reeled, not from fear, but from the dizzying precipice of this forbidden knowledge. Here, in its deepest throat, the air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of wet rock and the metallic tang of old rust. My breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the narrow shaft where I had set up my makeshift station. The flickering glow of the monitor cast stark shadows, dancing specters against the rough-hewn walls, each flicker a tiny pulse against the oppressive quiet. It pulled me further into its intricate web, a relentless current dragging me into unknown depths. Days had blurred into a single, interminable vigil. I had stripped away layers of noise, filtering, amplifying, searching for the underlying architecture. The raw data, once a chaotic storm of static and faint pulses, began to yield a fragile, unsettling order. I saw it first in the subtle shift of waveform amplitudes, then in the unexpected symmetry within the chaos. It wasn't a repeating sequence, not a simple code. It was something far more insidious, a self-modifying fractal of information. My eyes burned, tracing the intricate lines on the display, a tapestry woven from pure non-existence. A tremor ran through the mine, a low rumble that vibrated through the rock beneath my boots. Not an earthquake, I knew, but the deep, groaning shift of the earth itself, indifferent and ancient. It mirrored the feeling growing within me, a seismic shift in my own understanding. I had been seeking a message, a communication from something beyond. What I was uncovering was not a message to me, or to anything. It was a process, an ongoing state of being. The signal was not a tool, but the very essence of what produced it. It was the hum of an existence so vast, so utterly alien, that it had no need for language, no need for intent as humanity understood it. A specific motif began to coalesce, a repeating structure of non-repeating elements. It was like watching a ripple expand across an infinite pond, each new ring creating the potential for countless others, yet never truly forming a closed circle. I leaned closer, my forehead almost touching the cool screen, my breath fogging the glass. The air in the mine grew heavier, pressing in, as if the very rock walls were listening. This motif. It wasn't about creation, or destruction, or even knowledge. It was about negation. Each subtle variation in the pattern, each infinitesimal shift in frequency, implied an undoing. It was a constant, deliberate erasure, not of matter, but of possibility. It was a weaving of reality that, with every thread laid down, simultaneously unraveled 1,000 others. My mind reeled. I had always believed in the underlying laws, the fundamental constants that governed the cosmos. But this signal, this impossible artifact, suggested a deeper stratum of existence where such laws were merely transient illusions, convenient fictions that held sway only in the brief, flickering interval we called our universe. The signal's inherent structure implied that our entire reality, our galaxies, our stars, our very perception of time and space, was nothing more than a momentary, accidental configuration. A brief, irrelevant ripple in an ocean of infinite, self-erasing potential. The horror was not in a threat, but in an indifference so profound it dwarfed the concept of malice. We were a brief, unremarked distortion in a pattern whose true purpose was to ceaselessly unmake itself, over and over, into an eternity of nullity. My hands trembled, not from fear of death, but from the unbearable weight of this perception. The signal wasn't waiting to be perceived, it was perception, and its nature was annihilation. I knew, with a certainty that froze me to my core, that I could not unsee this. The truth, raw and unforgiving, had etched itself onto the very landscape of my mind. There was no turning back from this precipice. The universe I had loved, the orderly dance of distant galaxies, was a lie. My breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the narrow shaft where I had set up my makeshift refuge. My lamp cast a meager circle, pushing back the absolute black that felt less like an absence of light and more like a crushing presence. The knowledge I'd unearthed, not from a dusty tome or a whispered confession, but from the very static of the cosmos, pulsed behind my eyes. It wasn't information in the way a star's mass or a galaxy's redshift was information. This was a seeing, a terrifying clarity that peeled back the skin of the world. The signal, that impossible whisper from the void, was no longer a puzzle to solve, it was a key. And it had unlocked a chamber in my mind I never knew existed, a place where the familiar dissolved into something vast and indifferent. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn rock face beside me, the cool, gritty surface a desperate anchor. Before, these walls were just geology, ancient sediment, mineral veins, the slow, blind work of eons. Now, they seemed to breathe. The faint, ceaseless drip of water from the ceiling wasn't just gravity at work, it was a rhythmic pulse, a slow, deliberate beat echoing the patterns I'd discerned in the impossible signal. The fleeting distortions I dismissed as fatigue, the sudden shifts in my peripheral vision, the moments when a word would lose its meaning on my tongue, they weren't aberrations. They were glimpses. The static on my screens, the subtle hum that vibrated through the observatory's floor, even the way the wind sometimes sounded like a chorus of distant, alien voices outside my window, now coalesced into a terrifying symphony. The world wasn't just distorting, it was revealing itself. And what it revealed was not meant for human eyes or minds. A tremor ran through the earth, a low groan that vibrated up through my boots. It wasn't an earthquake, it was too deep, too resonant, a sound that seemed to originate not from shifting tectonic plates but from the very marrow of the world. It was the sound of something immense stirring just beneath the surface, something that had always been there, hidden by our limited perception. My rational mind, the mind that had charted nebulae and calculated stellar distances, screamed against this new understanding. It tried to reassert order, to find a scientific explanation, but the forbidden knowledge had already scorched the landscape of my intellect. I pressed my palms to my temples, trying to still the frantic churn of my thoughts. This wasn't madness, I told myself, though the thought was a thin, shivering lie. This was perception. A terrible, unwelcome gift. I could feel the thinness of the veil now, the fragile membrane separating our perceived reality from the vast, indifferent truth. And the truth felt hungry. A rustle. Faint, almost imperceptible. My head snapped up, lamp beam cutting a nervous arc through the gloom. Nothing. It was no longer empty. It was pregnant with unheard frequencies, with movements just beyond the threshold of my vision. Was it the mind settling? Or was it something else, something that had followed me, or perhaps, had been here all along, merely waiting for me to become sensitive enough to its presence? And now, I was being watched. Not by eyes, not by cameras, but by an awareness that permeated the very air, that resonated in the damp stone, that mirrored itself in the frantic pulse in my own veins. My breath hitched. I spun slowly, my lamp beam sweeping the narrow tunnel, searching for a source, for anything concrete. The distortions hadn't been random, they had been deliberate. Preparations. And now, the curtain was fully drawn. My hands, once precise instruments of cosmic observation, now trembled slightly as I arranged the final components of my desperate folly. The fractured mirror, salvaged from a forgotten vanity, caught the flickering glow of my lantern, scattering its light into 1,000 jagged reflections across the rough-hewn walls. I had positioned it to reflect the specific, impossible angle from which I believed the anomaly's whispers emanated. Surrounding it, in a crude circle drawn with damp chalk, lay a collection of resonant objects, a rusted tuning fork, a shard of obsidian, a length of tightly wound copper wire, each chosen not for any scientific property. For a felt resonance, a sympathetic vibration my shattered mind insisted upon. This was no longer science, it was a desperate ritual, a plea whispered into the void. I had been chasing the pattern, the impossible signal, for weeks, months, or perhaps an eternity. Time had become a meaningless construct, dissolving like salt in a rising tide. I needed to understand it, to make it stop, to sever the insidious connection that was consuming me from the inside out. Or, perhaps, to simply gaze directly into its heart, to welcome the final dissolution. My determination was a sharp, cold shard in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. I pressed the tuning fork against the obsidian shard. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the rock, through my bones, a sound that seemed to awaken the dormant echoes of the mine itself. The air grew dense, heavy, as if the immense weight of the earth above me had suddenly focused its pressure on this single, fragile point. The fractured mirror shimmered, not with reflected light, but with an internal luminescence, a faint, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from behind its silvered surface. "Show me what you are." The glow intensified. The chalk circle on the floor began to hum, a low thrumming sensation beneath my bare feet. They writhed, not like smoke, but like something solid, yet fluid, shifting into shapes that were almost familiar, then utterly alien, then gone. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it. I was pulling it closer. They spoke of vastness, of indifference, of a scale of existence that dwarfed my own to an agonizing insignificance. I was seeing behind the veil, and the sight was rending me. A scrape, faint, distant, from deeper within the winding passages. It was a sound of deliberate movement, of something heavy dragging across stone. I had believed myself utterly alone in this forgotten tomb, a solitary witness to the unraveling of reality. The fractured mirror pulsed with a frantic rhythm, its light now a blinding, disorienting strobe. The glyphs on the walls pulsed in time with it, burning themselves into my retina. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was methodical, rhythmic, the sound of boots on loose scree, echoing in the confined space. A light, a pinprick of orange, flickered into existence far down the tunnel, growing steadily brighter. Someone was coming. Someone had been drawn here, to this place where the fabric of existence was thinning, to witness my desperate communion. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the growing cacophony of the anomaly's silent roar and the approaching footsteps. My attempt to understand, to negate, had only served to open a wider door, not just for the cosmic horror, but for something else, something equally unknown and profoundly dangerous. Like something solid yet utterly intangible, pressing in from the periphery of the single lantern's trembling light. The low thrumming beneath my bare feet intensified, a vibration that began in the earth and climbed, not just through bone and muscle, but through the very marrow of my perception. It was a soundless resonance, a frequency that rattled the cage of my skull, threatening to dislodge the delicate balance of thought. I stood within the chalk circle, my breath catching in the frigid air of the abandoned mine shaft. The air itself seemed to congeal, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone, yet far older, a scent of forgotten time. The lantern, clutched in my trembling hand, cast elongated, dancing shadows that mimicked the writhing forms at the shaft's edge. But these were not mere shadows, they were voids given substance, drinking the light, pulling at the edges of my vision. The chalk lines, meticulously drawn, pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, mirroring the impossible signal I had chased across the cosmos and now into this subterranean tomb. It was no longer a distant hum on a spectrum analyzer, it was here, within the circle, within me. My voice was a fragile thing against the encroaching enormity. My determination, once a sharp, guiding blade, was now a trembling hand holding a flickering flame against an infinite night. But I would not falter. I had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back from the precipice of understanding. The glow from the chalk lines brightened, casting the rough-hewn rock walls of the abandoned mine in an ethereal, shifting light. The walls themselves began to ripple, not like water, but like a sheet of canvas caught in an unseen gale. The stone grain stretched, then compressed, then stretched again, each undulation echoing the thrum that now vibrated in my chest, threatening to shatter my ribs. My gaze was drawn to the center of the circle, where the air shimmered, coalescing into a focal point of absolute blackness. It was the signal's core, a window into the truth I had sought. I felt a pull, a silent gravitational force tugging at my very essence, promising answers, promising oblivion. The temperature in the shaft plummeted, breath crystallizing in the air, yet my hand felt as though plunged into a sunless, frozen sea. My mind reeled, assaulted by a torrent of non-information, a deluge of anti-patterns that defied interpretation. It wasn't a message I heard, but a perception, raw and unfiltered. It was full of a quiet, unyielding nothing that underpinned everything. It was the space between thoughts, the pause between heartbeats, the silent, indifferent truth that creation was merely a fleeting ripple on an ocean of non-existence. And it was aware. Not with consciousness as I understood it, but with an ancient, patient perception that simply was. The mine shaft around me began to buckle. The ceiling groaned, not with the sound of collapsing rock, but with a sound like tearing fabric, the very weave of reality coming undone. The lantern slipped from my grasp, falling to the floor with a dull clatter, its light immediately swallowed by the deepening gloom. Yet, I could still see, not with my eyes, but with a new, horrifying clarity. The chalk circle pulsed, the blackness at its heart expanding, consuming the light, consuming the air, consuming the very concept of mine shaft. I saw the walls not as solid rock, but as fleeting configurations of energy, shivering on the edge of dissolution. I saw my own hands, not as flesh and bone, but as transient patterns, flickering in and out of coherence. Time itself fractured, stuttering, looping, stretching. A moment became an eternity, then a blink. I felt myself simultaneously here and not here, anchored and untethered. The indifference of the core was not cruel, but absolute. It did not hate, it simply was. And in its being, my own existence, my struggles, my brilliance, my very humanity, were rendered utterly meaningless. A fleeting spark against an infinite, unfeeling night. This was the forbidden knowledge, the contagion that dissolved the self. I screamed, though no sound escaped my lips. My throat constricted, my lungs burned, but the sound was swallowed, not by the air, but by the expanding emptiness within the circle. My body felt like a mere suggestion, a temporary arrangement of atoms about to be reabsorbed. I was falling, not through space, but through the very concept of existence, into the patient, perceiving nothingness that had always been there, waiting. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sudden, overwhelming perception of everything and nothing all at once. The abandoned mine, the chalk, my own hands, they were all dissolving, becoming one with the immense, indifferent truth. And I, Cole Chen, was becoming something else entirely. I became the thrumming. The vibration that had climbed through the earth, through bone and muscle, now resided in the very core of my being, a dissonant hum that resonated with the silence. My eyes, once keen instruments of observation, saw not just the single lantern's trembling light, but the spaces between its photons, the faint, shimmering distortions in the air itself. I was no longer merely perceiving the abandoned mine, I was interwoven with its decaying structure, its ancient rock, its suffocating darkness. My body was a foreign vessel. I tried to push myself up, but my limbs felt weighted with lead, or perhaps, with something far heavier, the sheer inertia of revelation. The rough stone floor scraped against my bare forearms, a sensation so raw, so utterly present, it verged on pain, yet it was not pain. It was a truth, a texture, a contact that bypassed my nervous system and imprinted directly onto my awareness. Finally, I managed to push to my knees, then to my feet, swaying like a sapling in a gale. The lantern, still clutched in my hand, cast a sickly, jaundiced glow. But the light was a lie. The rock walls of the abandoned mine breathed. I saw it, the slow, undulating expansion and contraction of the ancient stone, like a colossal, dormant organism. A guttural sound escaped my throat, a dry, ragged cough that tasted of fear and triumph. I had seen it. I had felt it. The fabric had torn, and I was on the other side. There was no going back. The truth, once a theoretical construct, was now a visceral, inescapable reality, embedded in my altered perception. My feet found purchase on loose scree and slick, damp rock. I passed rusted mining carts, their wheels frozen in time. Yet, as I looked closer, the rust on their metal seemed to crawl, a slow, deliberate bloom of decay that moved with an unnatural, almost conscious agency. A trickle of water ran down a nearby rock face, catching the lantern's beam. But it wasn't just water. Within its clear current, I saw fleeting geometries, impossible angles that bent and twisted the light, then vanished, leaving only the mundane drip. This was the truth manifesting. It was not a grand, cataclysmic event, but a subtle, insidious reweaving of the familiar. The world wasn't breaking, it was changing, molecule by molecule, perception by perception. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible with the remembered. Every scientific principle I had ever known screamed in protest, yet my altered senses embraced the new reality with a terrible, undeniable clarity. It was as if my brain had been rewired to process dimensions previously beyond human comprehension. I pressed on, driven by a primal need to escape the crushing depths of the abandoned mine, but also by a fierce, terrifying curiosity. What else would I see? What else had been hidden beneath the veil of conventional reality? The path wound upwards, the incline becoming steeper. My breath came in ragged gasps, but the fatigue was secondary to the strange exhilaration that coursed through me. I was a pioneer in a landscape of impossible physics, a cartographer of a reality unmapped. Just as I rounded a bend, a sound, distinct from the mind's natural groans, reached me. A low, rhythmic clink clink clink. It was the sound of metal striking stone, a familiar sound, yet in my heightened state, it vibrated with an ominous resonance. I tightened my grip on the lantern, its light swinging wildly, creating dancing phantoms on the walls. Then I saw him. A lone figure, hunched over a section of rock, chipping away with a pickaxe. It was the security guard, a man whose face I vaguely recalled from my initial foray into the mine. He was muttering to himself, a low, unintelligible stream of words, his movements jerky and repetitive. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a croak. He stopped, slowly turning. His eyes, when they met mine, were wide and unfocused, like those of a man lost in a dream. But it was not his gaze that froze me. It was the rock he had been chipping. Where his pickaxe had struck, the stone was not merely fractured, it seemed to flow, like liquid obsidian, reforming itself even as he watched, erasing the marks of his labor. And on his face, in the faint light, I saw the same iridescent haze that had clung to the mining carts, a subtle shimmer around his features, distorting the edges of his humanity. He didn't acknowledge my question. Instead, he pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger at the reforming rock. "It's what it wants." My breath caught in my throat. He saw it too, or rather, he perceived the effect of it, even if his mind couldn't grasp the underlying mechanism. The truth was not confined to me. It was a contagion, seeping into the world, touching others, twisting their perceptions, or perhaps, revealing to them a sliver of what I now saw in its terrifying entirety. This wasn't just about my sanity, it was about the integrity of reality itself. I didn't wait for him to respond further. The thrumming in my chest became a frantic drum solo, urging me forward. I had to get out. I had to understand what I had unleashed. The light from the mine's entrance, a faint gray smear in the distance, beckoned like a false promise. I stumbled towards it, leaving the security guard to his Sisyphean task, his pickaxe resuming its futile clink 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 against the ever-shifting stone. When I finally pushed through the last, heavy wooden door and emerged into the pre-dawn air, the world outside was not the one I had left. The familiar pines that fringed the abandoned mine entrance seemed to writhe, their branches reaching with impossible, skeletal fingers towards a sky that pulsed with an unseen, yet deeply felt, rhythm. The stars, those distant, quiet dancers I had once loved, no longer held their fixed positions. They shimmered, coalesced, and reformed into constellations that defied all astronomical charts, a cosmic mockery of order. The breath that had caught in my throat dissolved into the chill of the abandoned mine, a vaporous sigh that seemed to carry the weight of impossible knowing. The air here was thick, not with dust or the metallic tang of ore, but with a palpable stillness, a profound absence that resonated with the silence between galaxies. My eyes, once straining for clarity, now perceived a different kind of vision. The rough-hewn walls, the skeletal timbers, the damp earth beneath my feet, they were not merely physical structures. They were membranes, thin and porous, barely containing the true nature of what lay beyond. I was no longer Cole Chen, the astrophysicist, tethered to the familiar anchors of scientific method and empirical observation. That man had been flayed, his mind peeled back layer by agonizing layer, until only this raw, exposed awareness remained. The anomaly was not a thing, not a force, not even an entity in any recognizable sense. And I, in my desperate pursuit, had merely opened a door, not to its arrival, but to my own integration into its pervasive reality. It felt less like stone and more like the congealed shadow of a forgotten thought. Every creak of the mind's stressed timbers was an echo of the universe's slow, inevitable unraveling. The dripping water, a monotonous rhythm from some unseen source, was the pulse of entropy itself, marking time until all structure collapsed back into the nothing from which it had momentarily coalesced. Sanity, I realized with a detached curiosity, was merely the comforting delusion of a contained reality. My sanity had not vanished, it had merely expanded, stretched beyond the breaking point of the human mind, to encompass a domain never meant for mortal understanding. I saw the world now as a fleeting illusion, a shimmering veil over an endless, hungry emptiness. The truth was indeed a contagion. I felt it, not as a sickness, but as a resonance. But their minds, blessedly, had recoiled. They had seen the effect, the ripple in the pond, but not the vast, bottomless ocean beneath. I was the one who had plunged in, who had become one with the current. I was a silent harbinger, walking among the living with the knowledge of their ultimate, insignificant fate. A broken victim, yes, for what was left of the Cole Chen who once gazed at the stars with hopeful wonder. Only a vessel, perhaps, a conduit for this terrifying understanding to seep into the collective unconscious, not through words or signals, but through the very act of my continued existence. Or a twisted prophet, not speaking of a coming doom, but embodying it, my every breath a testament to the fragile unreality of all things. The air grew heavier, pressing in on me, yet I felt no fear. Only a profound, desolate peace. The struggle was over. The quest for answers had ended, not in discovery, but in dissolution. I was complete. The nothing between stars was no longer waiting to be perceived, it was perceived, through me, in me.